Twilight just stood under the shower's current, letting the water soak into her mane and coat. The gray ash covering her body was slowly melting off, whirling down through below. Twilight stared down at the flowing blue and gray waters they twirled into the drain. It seemed so real. The idea not only was what she doing something so mundane, but that shower was still working. In this twisted world where everything was broken, locked, or in need of new part, just finding something that worked the way it was intended to. Twilight pulled some of the drizzling water into her hooves and splashed it into her face. She rubbed her face, feeling the burn of dry eyes sinking in. Her mind was racing throughout what it was happening, and yet she felt calm. She had moved her hooves and stared at the race in water once more, imagining each of them were through her thoughts. Some clear, some murky, all spiraling into unrecognizable pattern. "This doesn't feel real," she muttered to herself. "Have I really become that accustomed to this place? What's starting to make it feel like the real world was more than where I lived for years?" She groaned, covering her face with her hooves. She then let the water flow against her, wanting to feel the constant pulse of the pressure. "How long have I since been here? It doesn't feel like it's been a day, but..." Her mind recalled how many times she'd passed out, how often she found herself in a new location and with her mind disoriented. How long have I been outside? Has it been days, a week, or has it been a couple of hours? She shook her head, having a feeling situated from the mane smacked against her neck, a reminder that she was quite awake at the moment. Should ask Spike and Magus. They might have a better grasp of how much time has passed than I do. She did a quick check over at her body, making sure that the ash had been completely washed away before turning off the water. She sat for a moment, feeling the water drip off of her, before she stood up and gave herself a good shake. Her horn lit up and grabbed the towel hanging on the rack. She pressed on it against her mane, trying to dry off the remaining water that had soaked up. Twilight stepped out of the bathroom, with a towel wrapped around her neck, finding herself on the first floor of Applejack's house. She took a moment to look around the quiet hallway, feeling emptiness of the house without any of the Apple family living in it. She could hear the occasional whispering of Spike or Magus from outside the living room down the hall, but it certainly lacked of any feeling of life. Applejack's house always seemed to be excused, just like every pony else in town. Applejack and her family were to go missing. She tried not to worry about what had just become of her friend, but images of Rarity being impaled and the corpse-like of appearances of Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash were still fresh in her mind. With a shake of her head to try and reassure herself, she wandered back into the living room. "Ah, Twilight!" Spike said, getting up from his sitting position by the fireplace. He picked up a small tray he had kept near him and quickly ran over to Twilight. "I wasn't sure how hungry you might be, since I wasn't sure if you'd eaten or not, so I went ahead and made you a sandwich and tea." He held up the tray that had a small triangular sandwich filled with various bits of hay. Next to it was still a steaming cup of brown liquid. Her stomach suddenly let out a loud growl as her cheeks flushed, realizing how little she had eaten since she left the library. "Thank you, Spike," she said softly, picking up the tray with her magic and walking in front of the fireplace. She felt the heat from the fire spreading through the room, the crackling of the flames giving a simple ambience to the room. She sat down and placed the tray before her, Spike quickly taking a seat next to her, bearing a large smile. Magus then just sat in the large reclining chair next to the fireplace, his magic wrapped around a teacup he was previously holding to his lips, as his eyes continued to scan the pages of a book. Twilight grabbed the small sandwich between her hooves delicately. She looked at it curiously, tilting. It was slightly before she was putting it into her mouth and biting down on it. It certainly wasn't a particularly tasty sandwich. Simple bread with simple hay. It had a bland taste to it, but yet somehow was one of the most delicious things she'd ever eaten. She savored every bite, counting each chew she took of the sandwich before finally swallowing the first bite down. "You okay, Twilight?" Spike asked, looking up at her worriedly. Twilight broke out of the stupor. suddenly feeling the new dampness on her face. She put her hoof to her cheek and found fresh tears staining her cheek. She quickly rubbed her face, chuckling softly. Sorry, Spike. I'm okay, just being silly and emotional. She laughed softly, a feeling of gentle warmth growing in her chest as she spoke. She pushed the sandwich to her mouth and took another bite, closing her eyes as she savored every chew of the meal. It's delicious, Spike. Aw, it's nothing really. Spike fiddled with his fingers, brushing softly. Just some bread with a bit of hay in the middle. I would have made you more, but Magus said we could conserve food what we found, since we don't know when we'll find fresh food next. Twilight's eyes wandered as the scruffy-looking unicorn sat on the chair. He shrugged his shoulders, casually flipping a page in his book before placing the teacup down. It's only made sense, since we don't know how long we are going to be trapped in this strange town, and the food is obviously scarce. Magus spoke in a strange way once more. Twilight's eyes flickered at the oddity of hearing it. After all, I don't even know how I got here. I was in Stalliongrad when you met me. Next thing you know, I wind up in some fog-covered town called Ponyville. It's quite baffling, he chuckled, shaking his head at the notion. I suppose that's true. I don't even know how long we've been here, Twilight said, picking up her teacup with her magic. When I woke up, it's the first thing in the morning. At least I think I was. Apparently enough time passed for the night to fall and the sun to rise again, which it would mean at least a whole day has passed, and it doesn't feel like it's been that long. She took a sip of her tea to try and keep her thoughts calm. I agree. The passage of time does feel odd. Magus shrugged, flipping through another page in his book before stopping in thought. But I think it's more of a trick being played on than its actual day having passed. I think so too, Twilight said, after swallowing another bite of her sandwich. This place has its way of messing with your mind. It warps reality around and makes ponies do terrible things. She placed a half-eaten sandwich back on the plate, suddenly unable to finish it. I wouldn't be surprised if how much time has passed just to get another way than it gets in your head. Magus paused for a moment, contemplating through his thoughts before placing a bookmark to hold his place and closing the book. I have something I would show you, Miss Sparkle. He levitated the book to a nearby shelf and stood up, nodding his way towards the front door. It might give you some enlightenment on this strange world. Well, I could certainly use some after today. Twilight let out a soft sigh before standing up and following Magus out to the door. Spike was quick to follow as well, before Magus stopped at the door, turning to look at Spike. Spike, I think it'd be best if you wait for us in here in the barn. What? Spike asked, confused. But I don't want to leave Twilight's sight again. We just got back together, he said worriedly, not wanting Twilight out of his sight again. Magus, are we going far? Twilight asked, her brow furrowing with displeasure at the idea that she might end up separating from Spike, that like she had been before. Not far, Magus waved his hoof casually. Just around the side of the house where the animals are kept. We'll be within shouting distance of the door. See, Spike, I'm not going very far. Twilight wrapped her hoof around the baby dragon, bringing him to a deep hug. I'm not about to let myself get separated that easily from you again. Okay, Twilight, I trust you. The young dragon wrapped his arms around her in reply. But if I hear anything, I'm coming straight over. Right deal, Twilight chuckled, before giving her assistant a gentle squeeze and letting go. Magus opened the door to the dimmed world outside, and the two of them quickly headed out. Twilight kept her eyes shut at the expanse of the forest-dead trees before her, trying to spot anything that might be lurking within the depths. The thick fog had made it hard to see parts of the rows of trees, but Twilight was going to be vigilant. Magus stuck close to the edge of the house, walking straight for his destination. His eyes didn't seem to needlessly wander, as if he too was worried about the monsters that lurked behind the fog. He came to a stop at the side of Applejack's house. He raised his hoof, and he opened the doors that normally led to where the cows are kept. Now it seems to be devoid of life, empty as the rest of the town had been. It's right in there, Magus spoke up, magic challenging through his horn, and now the tip of it now gave off a bright glow. He stepped into the darkened barn, his head moving back and forth, if looking for something. Twilight followed him into the rotted barn, feeling the thick air hitting his lungs. She put a hoof up to her muzzle, almost reaching at the foul stench that assaulted her nostrils. Good, he's still here. Magus then almost cooed and stepped into the shadows, fading Twilight from his view. Who's here? Twilight asked, trying not to look at the darkness. But Magus didn't respond, only the sounds of heavy cloth being moved around heard. Not wanting to be blinded anymore, she raised her hoof and tapped on her pendant around her neck, instantly illuminating the aging barn. A loud wail screamed through the barn, piercing its ears, as if the sounds of metal and flesh smashed themselves into solid steel bars. Twilight yelped, jumping back in fear as her eyes fell upon the rotted skull of a decaying soldier pressed up against its container. It garnished its teeth, trying to attack the source of the light. Oh no, he didn't act like that very much, Magus chuckled as he watched the soldier thrashing through the confines of his cage. The creature seemed to be completely uninterested in him, but simply gashing out in anger by the bright light. Magus! Twilight cried, bewildered, her eyes darting back and forth from the caged monster and the pony that was standing next to it, almost admiring it. What are you doing? Get away from that monster! That seemed to catch Magus's attention. He turned his head, looking at her with a queer smile plastered across his face. Monster? They still look like monsters to you? What? Twilight stuttered, unable to even comprehend the words Magus had just uttered. Of course they are monsters. Just look at them! She pointed her hoof at the garnishing abomination that contained to try and cry out to stuff out the light. It's a walking corpse! How is it everything but a monster? Magus stared at Twilight for a moment, unblinking his fixed gaze. Twilight felt the hairs of the back of her neck begin to rise as her skin crawled. Before she heard his voice, an ominous cackle started to low, but then it began to grow. Magus then shook his head, as if she said was the funniest thing in the world. Twilight felt herself begin to tremble, her hooves unable to keep them still. Her mind began to race, wanting to pierce together what he had just said, but unwillingly take the final leap. Because if what he said is true, then she had... Allow me to rectify what that thinking, Miss Twilight. Magus spoke while turning to face the creature that had yet to cease its assaults. His horn began to glow with a dull, almost sickly glow. Twilight felt her breath begin to catch, unable to shake her eyes off of what was just transpiring before her. Something told her to cry out, to stop whatever was going on, and that she shouldn't have witnessed what was about to happen. But she was frozen on the spot, unable to move, unable to avert her gaze, unable to breathe, just stare. The light began to emit from beneath the soldier. It finally distracted from its assault and its appearance of the new threat. And then it was turning down, as if staring at the floor despite the caved holes where its eyes should have been. The sickly yellow light that could make the patterns being made, shapes being etched into the bottom of the steel cage. They slowly came to life, and that was what that Twilight recognized, what he just saw in scribbling beneath the creature. It was a symbol, the symbol he used to create the safe areas, one that killed any creature that was in its presence. Magus was going to kill the soldier. Before her senses could return to open her mouth and speak again, the light of the circle vanished before leaving the blue instead branded at the bottom of the cage. With a loud howling cry, the soldier began to thrash out of his cage. His whines echoed throughout the hollowed barn. His armor rattled and shake as the body inside of it began to suffer. Steam began to pour out through the edges of the rusty metal that covered its body, and its mouth opened wide in its sorrowful cry. Then, just before her eyes began to change, its rotted, decayed skin and creature began to shift as if its skin was leaving entity and was crawling along. Its host, it stretched and wobbled and covered the wounds that marred its body through the never-aging loss that look. The skin stretched into the holes within the soldier's face, into the mouth, and around its hooves. Twilight then stared in horror But just for a moment, the soldier no longer looked like a monster, but like a pony missing its eyes, but a pony held by fear, pain, and death. Just as quickly as it came, the moment passed and the skin began to shrivel up once more, squeezing down on the soldier, making it look malnourished and sickly. The skin tightened and began to gray. No longer it did cry out wails of pain, stunned in shock and silence of what followed. Then the creature began to fall apart. Its flesh and bones turned to dust and crumbling at the bottom of its cage. The metal fell with a loud bang into the bottom of the steel floor, and the soldier was no more. No longer able to carry her weight, Twilight fell into a sitting position, just staring in shock and disbelief what had just happened before her. You killed him. Her words were fragile, tumbling out of her mouth and hitting the ground with what felt like a shuddering crash in her mind. An unfortunate victim of research, but one that said so much more before he passed, Magus chuckled, staring at the metal dust of his handiwork before turning to face Twilight again. He looked at her in the eyes, although they didn't seem to look back, just out of the empty space before her. But I'd like to hear from you, Miss Twilight. What did you think of this display? Twilight's mouth opened agape, not unable to speak any words. Her mind was blank, unwilling to register the thoughts of what they were going through. She could feel herself being shutting down, not wanting to accept the register of thoughts that were going through it. But of course, in the reality of conclusions awaiting for her, she didn't want to accept it. But somewhere in her mind, she knew she had to face them yet. She'd been stabbed, cut, bitten, slammed into walls, thrown about, waded through the blood until her legs were soaked red. Her mind gave out the one last defense, to try and detain the momentum of sanity. No. Magus raised an eyebrow, curious of her choice of words. Magus, no. You can't tell me this. Twilight's voice began to shook. Her eyes began to burn down with tears. You can't tell me the monsters I've been. Her eyes began to squeeze shut as hot tears began to stream down her cheek. That those monsters have been ponies, flesh and blood ponies. You can't. She then looked at him, tears pouring down her face and her voice crackling, afraid. I've been killing those monsters, Magus. All out throughout this town, my hooves are stained with their blood. She then stared down at the hooves and the imagery of her sword flying through the air, taking life of the creatures, left, right, flashed before her. But if they're ponies? If they are ponies, Magus, then I... Her body began to tremble, her words caught in her throat. Her hooves uncovered her face as she curled up, trying to escape from the reality that was now bearing down upon her. Then you'll be a murderer. Twilight froze as Magus spoke the words. She then lifted her head, slowly looking through the bangs that hung over her eyes. As Magus spoke those words, she slowly lifted her head. But the eyes of the stallion that stood next to his cage, his strange way of speaking ever present. His eyes never seeming to show what was truly going through his mind. And that's true. You always will be. All those lives will be cut short because you swung your blade. The height of so many lives resting upon your shoulders. Twilight put her hooves on the ground, staring as if her mind reeled. I had no choice, Magus. They left me no choice. They attacked me. They intended to kill me. If I hadn't killed them, I would be dead. Good. Rationalize the killing. That'll make it easier for your cautious to bear, right? His words dug into her and bore straight into her core. She put a hoof against her snout, trying to keep her stomach from escaping her now. Taking the life of another pony is a heavy burden to bear, but I am sure that better than anyone. Twilight just broke out into a fit of sobs, curling onto the floor, wanting the truth to go away. She wasn't a killer. She didn't kill ponies. She defended herself against the monsters. Mindless monsters that wanted to kill her, to kill Spike, to kill her friends. If she didn't, she would die. They would die because the mindless monsters can't be reasoned with. But if they were ponies, of course that matters if you're taking indeed a pony. Magus spoke up, placing a hoof against the steel cage. Twilight then froze once more, confused by these new words. Her mind was still in a state of shock. These monsters you slay from my own research can conclude that they were once ponies. I don't see them as monsters, but simply just new specimens to study. Twilight was very shakenly, managed to get right herself on the floor. Still sitting, but not shaking, trembling tears like she had been. These are just the remains of the twisted, malformed by this word that has now a new use for them. I don't know quite what it means just yet, but you could have had no qualms over their deaths. If anything, they're just puppets. This odd way of speaking never broke the silence once more. He was just calm, talking about the gravity of the murderer, and he would just be the favors of his tea. Wait, what in Celestia's name is wrong with you? Was all Twilight could muster. She gently shook a cold, muddy mess of emotions, coursing through her mind as she tried to even make more sense of everything that was going on right now. Let's just say that I always have the bigger picture in mind. Magus smiled at the desolated smile, before he slowly began to walk back to the entrance that decayed in the barn. His loud echoing footsteps became muffled by the thick layer of the ash outside, before the air returned to its silence. She placed one hoof over the other, closing her eyes and breathing heavily. As the tears dripped down her cheeks, she needed to calm herself. She could feel her mind still shaking, wanting her to pay for all the horrible things she might have done. But she didn't do anything wrong. She had defended herself. She wasn't dead as far as she knew. Her friends weren't dead either. The searing hot pain flashed in her mind as the image of a white unicorn became stained with blood, long black sword piercing through its chest. Twilight grabbed her head in her hooves and giving out a wailing cry as her head hit the ground. Another hot vision flashed in her mind. Cavaders, two winged ponies, crawling towards her, begging, asking for love. She clawed at her mind. She raised her head and slammed it against the floor, a loud thud echoing her, becoming numb. Her body felt limp as she lay on her side, panting and breathing in as the heavy dust on the floor. She let out a loud cough, wanting to be rid of the intruder. She placed a shaky hoof against her own face, and she took in a few deep, shuddering breaths before finally starting to feel a semblance of calm come over about her. She was breaking down. She was a crying, sobbing mess of a pony on the floor, in the middle of the world that seemed fend off of her misery. She wanted to be home, curled up in front of the fire, reading a good book. She couldn't think of how many good times she had just wanted to wake up from this nightmare, just to see everything return back to normal and have her old good home back. But every time she thought she was getting closer to the answer, it might have been just whisked away again. Yet there was in her voice in the back of her head, the one that always seemed to show up, but just as she was willing to give up. It was low, painful voice that could barely utter a word, let alone out of silence. But it was there, and she could hear it pushing against her. Get up! Achingly, her body began to right itself up. She pushed herself up onto her haunches and put a hoof to her face. She took a few deep breaths. Something shuddering had calmed herself down. Rubbing the dirt and tears off of her face, she could stand on her hooves. She could walk if she gave herself a moment longer. She wasn't dead, and she didn't know for sure that her friends were dead, and the words of Lance were in her head. This place is only what I make of it. Twilight spoke out loud, lowering her head and covering both of her eyes. If I let it kill me, then I will die. If I let it kill my friends, then they would die too. She lifted her head, her eyes starting to show aware of tears and lack of rest. And if I will save them, I couldn't live without myself. I didn't even do everything I could to save my friends. With a calmer hoof, she pushed herself back upright. She was standing again, looking at the dark, abandoned barn once more. She figured it must have more answers for her right now, or else Magus would have shown her more. She gritted her teeth right now. That name sent a flash of anger into her mind. She felt more than deserved. He'd messed with her head and he'd made her fall into that breakdown. Her resolve was shattered and all broken, all because he had to open his mouth and say things that weren't true. If she needed to use that anger as a fuel to push on, then she would have just let him feel the full fury of Celestia's portrayal. She didn't even want to go back to the farmhouse just yet, not unless there was a reason to be in his presence again. But she didn't want to stay in the musty barn either, not with what she had just seen. She slowly looked around her, the light landing on the second door, opposite end of where she had came. That made sense to her. A barn would have doors on both ends. With both a short walk, he had reached to the door and pushed her hoof against it, opening in the barn once more. Quiet and dust filled the air. The white world returned to her vision as the aisles of dead trees lay before her. She was at the back of the house, a path that she remembered from when she had visited before. Just ahead of her, when she could see a path that was following, she could easily locate the Crusaders' clubhouse, although she wasn't willing to search the forests at the moment, not with the thought that she might be attacked once more by that pony from the vortex once more. Her mind wandered slowly from her, just wanting to relax for the moment while it recuperate, and when the loud of her sound of the wood cracking came to her ears, her body instantly froze as her head slowly turned in the direction when she had heard it. A second loud crack echoed over the woods when she honed over her vision on the spot. A third loud crack, she had found the source. In the distance, amongst the trees, creating a fourth loud crack, assaulting one of the trees, an orange blur was moving about. Her heart felt like it stopped. She focused harder on the orange blur that she'd never ever focused in her whole life. It moved, sauntered slowly from one tree to another, before raising its legs, striking hard at the base, followed by a loud crack that echoed throughout the trees. No monsters were around it. No fog was playing tricks in her eyes. It sounded mistakable. Her eyes and legs started moving before her, even when she gave the order. Her body was moving in a full sprint, not even for a moment doubting this destination. This wasn't the other world that had been playing tricks on from walking to one room to the next. This wasn't some delusion or dream or weird mirror world. The blur was real. She was drawing closer to it. A shape she knew, a shape that she was familiar with. "Applejack!" Twilight cried out. Not even realizing that she had taken the moment to see, drew a huge breath. Her eyes darted forward and saw the orange blur had stopped, and it became clearer as she drew closer. Tears were in her eyes, slowly coming back. There was an orange pony looking back at her, one looking bewildered and confused. Before realization that dawned the pony's face, "Twilum," was all Applejack could say, before she was criminally tackled by the purple unicorn. The two of them landed in the aspen forest. 4 legs were wrapped tightly around each other. The two of them stayed like that, just tugging the tight for a moment, what felt like it would last forever. "Twilight, it's really you, isn't it? You're alive! Oh, thanks, Celestia, you're alive!" Applejack squeezed a little tighter in the hug. "Well, I've been looking for you everywhere for you and the others. Well, I don't know what's going on in this crazy place." "I've been looking for you too, Applejack." Twilight smiled, finally pulling back from the hug, visible tears at the edge of her eyes once more. She took Applejack's hoof and helped her up to sit up. "Although I'm really just as confused as you are about what's going on. I woke up in the library and Ponyville was just like this. What's happened been me to you too?" Applejack said, adjusting her hat, her face growing serious. "Granny Smith was the one who woke me up, saying she was gathering the family downstairs. At first I thought it was just the middle of the night, but it didn't take long to realize the windows were boarded shut. Apple Bloom was getting scared, but Big Mac was able to calm her down. We couldn't seem to escape no matter how hard we pounded on the wood covering the windows or the walls. We eventually found a key that lets us out and saw this." Applejack waved her hoof forward towards the fog and dead trees. "And something wasn't right. So I told them to stay put when I went and found you and the others." First, Applejack flicked her hat in annoyance. "That fat load ain't good. It did, though. Ponyville was no better off, and I was just running circles to find some pony, And eventually, though, I found this. Applejack then pulled her hat off, reached inside before pulling out an aged piece of paper and handed it to Twilight. Taking it carefully, Twilight had unrolled, seeing that it was a messy black writing on the form of the riddle. $1, $2, $3, $4. Dead leaves and hollow trees, free are gone for you to find. A key that we have hidden to be so kind. It left in a bad taste in my mouth too, Applejack said, seeing the look of what appeared on Twilight's face. She even replaced it on the hat and then continued. I immediately rushed back to the barn, but everyone was missing. If they had gone to search, they would have left a note. If only seen something Big Mac would have left it. Something happened to my family, Twi. And the only clue is that I have a note saying stuff about a key and hollow trees. The only thing I could do is seeing if there's a hollow tree in the orchard that is holding a key. Applejack turned her head in the invertible forest. That could be normally seen covering the hills, as if not for the fog. But there is just so many, I don't even know if I can even find it. I see, Twilight said, swallowing the knot that had formed in her throat. It's been the same story everywhere I've been. Missing ponies, strange riddles and puzzles, monsters hiding in the shadows. Monsters? Applejack said, interrupting Twilight's train of thought. Haven't seen any monsters. Are you telling me there's monsters out here too? What? Twilight asked, confusion that was still drawing on her face. They've been all over Ponyville, Applejack. These zombie-like ponies were wearing ancient royal armor, carrying weapons, or decaying dragon that is watching the skies, or that ones that eat books, the ones that have sickles for legs and giant leeches of the remains of other ponies. To get there, I ran from a dragon and an orb some like monstrosity. You see none of that? Bewilderment, confusion, anger, hesitation, and jealousy. Twilight couldn't put a hoof of what kind of emotion she was feeling, but it was welling up inside of her. Twilight, there aren't any monsters in Ponyville. I've been there for hours. The town's empty. Are you feeling all right? As if color had drained from Twilight's face. There was no way Applejack had traveled through Ponyville for hours without having to run into a single monster. Spike had seen them as well. Rarity had seen them. Magus had. They still look like monsters to you? Her mind began to play back on the memory of her sword, tearing each of the monsters that she had slain, remembering the feel of her hot blood and flesh in her hooves, the terror of them coming to kill her, only for her to come out of the top. She could still see the blade tearing through their flesh. The only thing I saw in Ponyville was a hooded figure that talked like Zecora, Applejack muttered. You did? Twilight was able to snap out of her thoughts, looking at Applejack for something to cling on to. Did she say anything? Yeah, she's murdered something awfully cryptic. Not that I know anything she was talking about. I had a hard time understanding that fancy riddle talk. Applejack shook her head, frustrated. But you saw her, right? She spoke to you, and then just quickly appeared and disappeared, right? Twilight was grasping for foundament. Yeah, how did you know? Applejack asked, surprised. I've seen her too, AJ. I don't even know what she is, but she seemed to be following us around Ponyville. I don't even know if she's one of those monsters or not, but there's proof that I'm just not seeing things. There are monsters out there. Like Spag and Magus have seen them too. I know I'm not hallucinating, Twilight said, reassuring herself more than everyone. But the foundation she kept her sanity was shaking, constantly being knocked over and rebuilt. But she was going to keep it together, even if it ended up killing her. I believe it, Twi. I just haven't seen any myself. It's been quite quieter around here since Silent Movie out there. Applejack adjusted her hat again, before looking at her shoulder, the dead trees around the farm once more. And I still need to find that key for one of the trees out here. If it helps me find out what happened to my family, then I'll reckon I'll tear each of them down if I have to. I understand, Applejack, but when I came to Sweet Apple Acres, I was chased by a huge monster. One I just barely got away from. It's not safe out there in the trees. We should go regroup with Spike and Magus in the house. Together we could think of a better plan than just kicking every tree. I reckon that does make a bit of sense, Applejack said softly, flickering her hat once more. Just one question. Who's Magus? He's a pony I managed to find while searching for you guys. He's looking after Spike while I search. He's actually managed to make safe spots around the town, places where monsters can't get in. Well, the safe house is as long as he's in there. That's heck of a convenient pony to run into a town like this, given the fact that I haven't run into any pony else for hours. And do you think what have happened to him find him these safe spots he make? That don't strike you suspicious? Applejack raised an eyebrow curiously, obviously already thinking about her safety. Twilight bit her lip and thought, even though she couldn't deny the strange feeling Magus had given her whenever he talked all of his words, it all seemed to come out in a strange way, not quite flat, but not quite remotive either. He put an emphasis on the words that didn't really need them, and he said things that might seem normal for an unusual manner. She couldn't get it out of her head what he had just said and done in the barn. And now he had just shown her that the monster just had... I asked him to watch over Spike, and he did. He kept Spike safe, out of harm's way, even though I don't fully trust him. He's at least kept his word. Spike is safe with him, and I'm sure of that at least. Twilight didn't even sound completely reassured, as if she was just convincing herself just as much as Applejack.